in the current year, and it costs about $23 million. So those are the credits. The next thing to talk about is exempt property. There's a lot of property in this state that doesn't pay any property taxes. You've got fully exempt property, like churches and nonprofits. There's over $8.5 billion of valuation in these types of organizations that is fully exempt from property tax. You've got partially exempt property, where an owner might make an improvement and be eligible for a tax abatement. There's some other different programs where part of your, usually it's the improvements that you make on your property can be exempt for a certain period of time, and that adds up to about $3 billion. And then, of course, there's all sorts of government property that the assessors don't even bother assessing, so there's no value assigned to any of that. But that's all exempt property. And if you look at that, I mean, even the exempt and partially exempt non-government property is, over $11 billion, and the tax base, I think we showed earlier, was about $110 billion. So that's about 10% of the tax base that's exempt right off the bat, and we're not even talking about government property yet. Okay, so that's how we get from assessed value to taxable value. We start with that equalized assessed value, take off the rollback, apply any sort of military exemption if applicable, take off the homestead credit if that applies, and that'll get you down to your taxable value. So that's the end of valuation. We've got rate and levy to go through yet, and I told you valuation would be the biggest one, and I was right. So, any questions about any of the valuation topics we've covered? Up front here in the yellow.
Did I understand you right? You said the state by code has to pay 100% of the homestead?
She asked if the state code, could you hear that? I couldn't tell if the mic was on or not. Anyway, she asked if the state code requires the state to pay 100% of the homestead. Well, the answer is yeah, it does, but the state legislature gets to rewrite the code every year, and kind of notwithstanding this part of the code, we're only going to pay X dollars amount. And it's hard, you can't really have a fair fight when one side is changing the rules every year, but that's the power they have, yeah.
Is that on? Yes, I understand the allowance for homestead exemptions is being cut in half for 2009, is that correct?
No, the governor initially proposed to cut the homestead credit in half, down to $50 million, but after enough yelping or whatever, the legislature kept funding at the same level for next year, that $100 million level. Okay, let's move on to these last two topics here. First is the rate. Let's just skip right through this slide because this just tells you what we're going to talk about. The first thing to talk about is rate limits. Counties have a variety of rate limits. In the general basic fund, they can only levy $350. In the rural basic fund, they can only levy $395. Just a quick background on county budgets for those not all that familiar. If you've got a county service that's intended to benefit the entire county, that's supposed to be paid out of the general fund. If you've got a county service it's intended mostly to benefit the rural residents, then that's supposed to be paid out of the rural fund. The idea being, if you've got a service that the county provides to the rural residents and the cities are providing it to all of the city residents, if the county paid for that out of the general fund, it'd be kind of like double taxing the city residents. They'd have to pay their city tax for the service and then the county tax for the same service. So that's the distinction between the general and the rural fund. There are also a number of other smaller funds that have their own limits, like a Pioneer Cemetery Fund and Unified Law Enforcement. Cities have their own rate limits, as do schools. On the next slide, even though these are called rate limits, for counties, there's a way to get around them. Counties have the authority to exceed these basic rate limits, the $350 general and $395 rural, whenever anything within a list of unusual circumstances happens. There's about 7 items listed in the code as unusual circumstances, And if one of those things happens, the counties can publish a notice that say, look, our maximum is 350, but this unusual circumstance is happening, so we're going to go over that. We're going to levy $4 instead. And that has to be published in the newspaper along with the notice of the public hearing on the budget. Now, this had not, to my knowledge, had never been done before 2005, but that was when we had the big decline in ag values, and counties lost a lot of rural counties lost a lot of their valuation. And as it turns out, one of the unusual circumstances is a reduced or low valuation growth. So every county, to my knowledge, that has ever used this since 2005, and there are about 25 counties that do so in the current year, has said the unusual circumstance we're using is a reduced or unusually low growth rate in the property tax base. Now that might change this year because another unusual circumstance is a natural disaster or other emergency, and that could very well be in place in a number of counties after last summer. In addition to what I mentioned so far, on the next slide, all these other governing bodies have their own rate limits. The assessor, community college, townships, county hospitals, they all have rate limits. In addition to rate limits, on the next slide, counties also have funds that are limited in other ways. Counties provide a lot of mental health services, and the mental health fund is limited not by the rate, but by the levy, by the actual dollar amount that can go into the fund each year. Counties have supplemental funds too, which are limited by use. The rate can go as high as it needs to, the dollar amount can go as high as it needs to, but you can only spend money on this list of certain things: voting equipment, insurance, certain employee benefits. There's a list of maybe about 10 or 12 items in the code. Then there's the constitutional limit on the debt service fund. And that says that cities and counties can only incur debt equal to 5% of their assessed value. No county is anywhere near that amount. A number of cities are. In fact, the city average is about 3.3% statewide. There are a number of cities that are bumping right up against that 5% limit. The highest county is 1.3%, so no counties are anywhere near that. As for setting the rate on the next slide, the way I think it generally works is that within the limits, and after considering whether they want to exceed the limits, if the unusual circumstances exist, the Board of Supervisors determines the amount of money that the county needs for the next fiscal year. Then they'll divide that number by the taxable valuation that they have. And then they multiply that by 1,000, because remember the rate is expressed in terms of dollars per thousand. And that'll give you the rate. So if the county decided it needed $3.5 million in its general fund, and there was $1 billion in taxable value, you just divide 3.5 by $1 billion, multiply it by 1,000, and you get a tax rate of $3.50. On the next slide, it's not uncommon. In fact, it's very common for taxpayers and the media and even county officials to some extent to focus on the rate. I mean, you'll often hear somebody saying the taxes went up in my county this year. The taxes went up from $11 to $11.15. And what they're talking about is the tax rate going up, because that's kind of an easy number for the public, counties, county officials, media to just kind of latch on to. I mean, it's easier to say the tax rate went up than it is to say the total taxes collected by the county went up from $3.5 million to $3,600,000 or something like that. So because the public and the media focus on the rates a lot, some counties have kind of adopted a somewhat informal policy of trying to keep a steady tax rate as a goal from one year to the next. And that's just fine to do. What it means, though, is that if the county wants to keep the rate the same, then the county is basically given up control over how much money it collects, because it's just applying that constant rate to whatever the new value is the next year, which is set by the assessor. So the county supervisors can decide to control the amount of money it wants, or it can decide to control the tax rate, but it can't really do both. It's got to pick one or the other or do some kind of combination thereof. Outside of the county rate, if you add up all the different tax rates that a person pays, county, city,